Hello, welcome everyone. We're going to give people a few seconds to join. So we will be doing a small Q&A towards the end. So if you have any questions throughout, you can add them to the chat and just make sure to send them to everyone, not just to hosts and panelists. As we wait, add where you are calling from in the chat. Alrighty, so without further ado, we're gonna get started on today's Tiger Hall webinar. Our session features Nelly Wartoff, who is CEO of Tiger Hall and chairperson of the ECLC. Today's topic is how to do change activation for ERP implementations. Nelly, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie. And thank you, everyone, for being here and spending time with us talking about ERP implementations. What could be more exciting than ERP? That's all our favorite projects, isn't it? For those of you who haven't met me, I'm Nelly Wartoft. I'm the founder and CEO of Tiger Hall. Tiger Hall is a change activation platform which helps organizations scale change activation across multiple initiatives. And something that we do a lot of, maybe too much of, is ERP implementations. So what I'm going to talk about today is how do you best do change activation for ERP implementations, what works and doesn't work, and some best practices, and field all of your questions. So feel free to put questions in the chat as we go or use the Q&A. And there's some polls as well throughout to get to know each other a little bit better. So let's begin with one of those, actually, to get to know who's in the room. Where are you at in your ERP journey right now? To get an idea of, are you in the planning stage? Are you already rolled out? Have you gone live? And I see some already done multiple ERP rollouts. And then we know who's in the room. Give it 10 more seconds. Okay, so a little over half of you are in the planning and pre-implementation. Great. That's actually the best stage to be in for this webinar. So very glad to see that many of you are there. Some are mid-rollout, that also works. Some recently went live. And we have some that have done multiple of these as well. So great. But that's good to know that we have a lot in the planning group, because that's when you can do a lot of these things as well. Awesome. Okay. So let's dive in. There are two types of ERP implementations, right? Just like there are two types of people in the world. There are those who go waterfall, big bang, let's go live, everything spikes, everything is a party, it's a big, big event, and then it slowly starts to fizzle out. And then there are others that do not do it as big in the beginning. It's not that big, go live, go rah-rah, but it's rather, how do we roll this out step by step and go live, and then do that timely reinforcement. Because when we think of ERPs, a lot of it is adopting many, many different modules, many different workflows from many different types of audiences. So doing that always on timely reinforcement is a very big piece of it. So for those of you who said you've done multiple ERP implementations, you might recognize that some of them have been the right side, some of them have been the left side. These tend to be the two main kind of rollouts that we're seeing. And there are a lot of challenges with the one on the left, right, where you suddenly start seeing the adoption going down, consultants are leaving, go live has happened, and then where is the adoption then going? And looking today to bring some data into this, it is a lot of ERP projects that fail to meet their objectives. Over half actually do that compared to what the initial business case and an implementation plan was. 85% of orgs struggle with user adoption, so that tends to be by far the number one challenge. So if that is a challenge that you have, you're definitely not alone. And many are also caused by inadequate change management, right? So it is very common to, when you do an ERP implementation, to over-focus on the SI and the data and all the data migration and so on, which is, of course, super critical. There is no ERP implementation without it. But many times OCM can come on the back burner, and then that shows up as pain later on in the process, right? So that is also very common. So curious with those that said you have done this before, and even if you're still in planning, what's been the biggest challenge when you've done this historically? Is it getting teams to change how they work, sustaining adoption over time, moving too fast, siloed rollouts, or like measuring whether it actually worked? What's been the number one challenge? And there should be an option to click many of them, I realize as well. We'll give it 15 more seconds. Okay, so this is interesting. So 38% getting teams to change how they work. Absolutely, that tends to be a big one. Interestingly, a lot are moving too fast with not enough enablement. Very common as well. Like people just like moving too fast, we're rolling it out very quickly, and we're getting ahead of ourselves with not enough enablement to support it. Interesting. Super. Okay, that informs as well for the discussion and conversation we're about to have. So when you look at traditional rollouts, it tends to be overly focused on what the leaders, when I say leaders, as in the transformation team, change team, business leaders, what they need to do to get it live. And it tends to be this insane focus on a go live date. And the go live date is the big milestone that everyone is working towards. You have a strategy, you pick the ERP, you bring in consultants, you do the UAT testing, and then there's this big, big event. And somehow it ends up being like 90% of resources are focused on that pre-go live. And then what happens after go live is like, yeah, let's hope and pray that everything is going well, right? But there is this massive focus on just the go live piece. And that's the first part of the problem, because actually when we look at the challenges, and what many of you shared as well, is that adoption phase. Like, how do we actually get people to change the way they work and not moving too fast once we're in that adoption phase, right? So if there is this mentality of like where change isn't always on, which we all know it is always on, but many have this on-off switch mentality and kind of like, okay, go live is done, so then all is well, right? Very checklist and output focused. And that's another problem, very focused from like a change management perspective, what needs to get done, rather than what actually drives employees to change and change the way they work. And then many times it's guesswork, right? Like we don't have real-time feedback on like what actually works, what doesn't, how do we adapt to different audiences and how they adopt the system. That tends to be lacking as well. And we all know the cost of doing it when it's that go live that is treated as the finish line. Everything that happens after that, you see low adoption, which is very bad ROI, because ERPs are super expensive, extremely expensive. It's tens of millions of dollars over multiple years, right? So this is not a small investment. And if people aren't using it, we've seen multiple times where people end up having like up to 35, 36 ERPs at the same time in large organizations, right? So one organization with about 200,000 employees, they are at 36 ERPs. Grown through acquisitions, not properly integrated it. And that's very, very expensive to pay 36 ERP providers, right? Even someone I spoke with this week who's on 2 thinks that 2 is too much, like we need to get everyone on 1. And that is, of course, the goal. So if people aren't adopting it, people aren't using it, big, big loss, right? And you know, the low ROI on these big investments, that's not something that any CFO wants to see. And then you have these redundant systems and technology lying around. And also the governance risk. Like many times I talk to organizations that think that everyone is using the ERP for everything. And then they go out to a manufacturing site and people are like, oh, like what ERP? Like what system are you talking about? No, like we have it here. I've written this on a note that we have here on the site. Like this is all handwritten. And that's something that the organization isn't aware of. So the governance risk is also a real one when you might end up with many of these shadow processes that aren't really monitored, and then you don't know what's happening in the background. So lots of challenges. You are very familiar with this as well. So I'm preaching to the choir, which is likely why you're here. So let's talk a bit about change activation then, and what's the difference between approaching ERP implementations with a change activation approach compared to what I would call maybe a change management approach, which is more that kind of checklist, go live, big project, big waterfall, and then let's see what happens. So when we talk about change activation is about the triple A's. It starts with alignment. and getting everyone aligned on what is their role in this change, what are the expectations, why should they even care about in the first place. And that's something that many forget, right? Because you go and tell someone we're going to roll out a new ERP, that's not very exciting. Most people are not very excited to hear that. So how do we align people to know, like, why should they care about this? Why should they care about a new ERP coming out? They would rather do anything else than adopting a new ERP, right? So that's where the first piece is: how do we align and make sure that people know why they should care about it? Of course, adoption is a very big piece. That's what we want. We want to change how they work. We want to make sure they adopt the new system. And then adaptation, which is missed in so many cases in that classical traditional approach, where it doesn't really adapt to how are different people adopting it and what their needs are. So adaptation is a very critical component in change activation, to actually understand what works with different audiences and how can we adapt to the way they're adopting or not adopting a new technology, for example. And then the whole point of this is that it's not linear, right? It's not sequential. It's not like you start with a plan, then you go live, and then you're done. It's an iterative, agile process. And that's why the adoption is sustained over a very long time. It's very high adoption because you have this always on iterative process that actually adjusts to what different people need. So let's look at these three one by one, and starting with alignment. And the key thing when it comes to alignment is that personalization bit, and making sure that it's not a big campaign going out like, hey, we're doing a new ERP, this is going to be great, but rather, okay, what is actually changing? Why are we changing it? And why does that impact you? And doing that for specific groups, right? So personalization is the critical element to drive that alignment up front. And when I say personalization, many people think that personalization means messaging and how we talk to different people. And yes, it absolutely does. Personalizing in messaging is a very, very big part of it. But personalization also includes cadence. Like, how often do we talk to different people? And this is extremely critical in ERP, right? Because when you look at ERP implementations, one of the things that makes it complex from a change perspective is the fact that everyone will be using it differently with different levels of complexity, different modules, workflows, and so on. And comparing a finance person who's in there every day to a salesperson that applies for annual leave once a year, very different kind of approaches, right? So messaging is one, but also the cadence and like how often you talk to them, and the timing, like when do they actually get activation, right? This is not about putting everyone through a ton of workshops up front and hoping they get it, but rather how do we deliver the right content, the right messaging, the right reinforcement, guidance, enablement, all of it to the right person at the right time. And if there's something that I've learned in the 7 years I've been doing this, is how much that timing aspect matters. And if you can get the right time when someone starts a workflow, when someone hasn't done something in a particular time, like anything about that timing aspect has about a 8 to 10x difference in change adoption. So the data points to time as being a very, very critical component to get right here. And when we think of time, time is about when you do something, when you're not doing something, how many times you've done something. And all of that is driven by workflow-based personalization. So if you look at the three different levels of personalization, there are many who still do no personalization. And it's really that like party ERP, we're rolling it out and the same thing goes to everyone. That's no personalization at all, just like a mass rollout. There are quite a few actually organizations that do demography-based personalization. So that's like, okay, you're the finance department, you get the budgeting module enablement, right? So that kind of HRIS based segmentation, that is good too. The ultimate would be the workflow-based personalization. So this is where you're really getting true personalization because it captures not only who someone is, but also what type of ERP user they are, how often they're doing it, what their top concerns are, where they're challenged, all of those areas. So, because you could have two people in the finance team, for example, doing workflows very differently or different frequency, and having it delivered to them at the right time. That's what that workflow-based personalization is all about. So that's a key thing when we look at personalization. So messaging is one, but also cadence and that timing and tying it to when they need that particular adoption activation. And another thing when it comes to personalization, if we look at different groups, the employees in an organization, they don't really care whether something is communications or training or reinforcement or sustainment or job aids, like whatever it is, right? For them, it's just tell me what to do. Just tell me what to do, what I need to do now. Why is this changing? Why, like I just started this workflow. What do I need to know right now? So when you think of activation journeys, it's about combining, think communications, enablement, and also everything in between to create this very holistic understanding of like, why does this matter? What is changing for me and what do I need to do, right? And then coming back to that timing in personalization as well. So if we take two extremely simplified example here, if we look at procurement and the ops team, for example, starting with what's changing in PO approvals compared to what's changing on the floor, that could be a start of that why. But then the second one, the procurement team might be like, first day, what no longer happens over email? Like, what is that first day checklist? Because they might be doing this every day, right? Whereas the ops team, when it comes to how do we log receipts in the new ERP, that might be something they just need to know when they're doing it. So that might not be something they need to know right away up front. So that's also where this timing comes in, right? So it's both in how you layer out and how you think about it and when they're getting the different enablement pieces. So think of it as combining both communications, enablement, and everything in between, because for an end user, if they have something in the inbox, there's something on the LMS, there's something in the intranet, and there's something said in a town hall, it becomes this very scattered experience. And I usually compare it to like if you watch a Netflix show and you see the second half of episode 8 before you see the first half of episode 2, you're like, who's the bad guy? What was I supposed to do here? Like completely lost the plot. So making sure that people get it in the right order, but that order can differ for different teams is another key component. And then, of course, the messaging. So personalizing the content to what is changing for different people. And this used to take a lot of manual work, right? You would need 50 to 100 people to do this at very large scale, to create personalized content and to create that for different groups and with the right format and length and tone and so on. And localizing, just like translating it, was a big thing before. Now the beauty is that we have technology and AI does a fantastic job of doing this. And if you're using an AI-powered change activation platform like a Tigerhall, that is all built in, right? So if you're looking at the why, if you have leadership, strategy documents, like anything that talks about why are we making this change, that is what then feeds the system, but then pairs that with the different audiences and tells them exactly why. Like, why are we changing this for procurement compared to the sales team, compared to any other audience? And then a big beauty here is you have any ERP provider that you're working with, whether it's SAP or Oracle or Workday or anyone else, they would have a lot of product documentation. They would have a lot of guidance on all the different workflows, and they have a lot of technical product documentation as well. All of that is great context for an AI engine and an LM to produce content around. And the more context, the better, right? So you could actually feed it entire product documentation guidance around how different things work and how the entire platform is set up. And then it creates these bite-sized nudges, content, communication, enablement, and so on from that documentation. So you no longer have to spend all of that time like sitting yourself and understanding, okay, like this is how this process is mapping and how that maps to this particular workflow, and then doing like screenshots and pasting screenshots into Word documents and creating that as PDFs and emailing it out to people. You literally just have to take the product documentation and the stakeholder groups and then combine that, and then AI does figure that out. So there's a lot of power that AI gives you in this area specifically. So anything personalization, anything personalized content, AI is super powerful here. So that's on that alignment. How do we get to alignment to begin with? And then coming to adoption, which is, of course, the biggest piece. So now we have people are aligned to, okay, like what's changing for me? Like they have not been through this like big blast campaigns, but they have just gotten nudges. Okay, this is what's changing for me. This is how this impacts my role. This is how it will make it better, how it will make it faster. Then it gets to how do we get people to actually change how they work, right? And many of you said this in the poll, this is the biggest challenge. And this is when we start looking at automated reinforcement and how do we automate that reinforcement so that it doesn't drop off and become that ERP implementation on the left where it's a big bang and then it just trickles out. But how do you make it more to the right side where it's that always on and adoption keeps going up to the right? So question for you here, looking at your ERP rollouts now, how would you rate adoption in your last or your current ERP program? And given half of you are in the planning stage, I would expect maybe somewhere like too early to tell. Give 15 more seconds for people to respond. All right. So we have 4% of this group, which is a little over 100 people in this room right now. 4% says strong, people adopted quickly and it stuck. 55% mixed. So that's absolutely in line with what we see a lot of the times as well. Some teams do well, others struggling more. Some are weak, behavior didn't really change, and some still in that planning phase, too early to tell. Interesting. Okay, so most are mixed. And that's usually what happens, right? Like it's very different for different teams. And that's also why that adaptation phase is so critical, because being able to adapt to the teams who are doing well compared to the ones who are struggling becomes very, very important. Because if you keep peanut butter spreading the same thing to everyone, that is not really helping the people who are struggling. And it also usually leads to overwhelming the people that are already adopting it and already doing well. So looking at adoption, the challenge with adoption many times is that there is so much difference between different groups and also different levels of complexity. Again, if we take super simple example here, right, you think of something like an annual leave application, like easy to do, like you don't need to pull everyone into a 6-hour workshop to tell them how to do an annual leave application. But equally, if you just send out a quick email about how the new PO processing works, like how that process goes, that might be a lot of people struggling with just that one email, right? So a big challenge in adoption tends to be, how do we adapt to different groups and who are different users of different modules, different workflows, and how can we enable them to be supported in the right way? So it's both the workflows they're using, but also how they're adopting it. So like adoption data becomes important, and something that we call response data, which is how do they respond to it? Are they positive to this? Are they thinking like, why does this need to change? And all of those data points become very key for being able to drive adoption at a very large scale. And that's because of this complexity. And you have different user personas who are using it for different reasons of different frequency, right? So something that works really well in this is we've talked about the persona-based personalization, and many are doing that demographics layer where do you sit in the organization, who do you report to, what's your role, etc. Something that works really well is workflow-based personalization. And if you're doing an upgrade within an existing system, say you're on SAP and you're upgrading to S/4HANA, for example, then you would have a lot of this data sitting in your system. If you're moving from a completely different system, say you're switching from Oracle to SAP, then this is data that you can usually export or get access to in a data lake in some way. And the way that you then do this is you look at the workflows, and for sure there will always be some net new workflows that no one has ever done before, but look at the legacy data and then segment your audiences based on what workflows were they using in the legacy system and how often. So you can take things like workflows, actions, frequency from a legacy system to then map out the different audience groups too. And this works extremely well. So because you would always have power users with certain modules, you will have like the occasional decision maker, or people are like super new. So that's one thing that you can do, is to look at that data and then map your audiences based on that. So instead of saying Tom is in finance and John is in sales, hey, actually Tom is a power user in this particular workflow, and John is not a power user in that, but he's a power user in this other workflow, for example, and even how often someone does something. So really powerful data to build out those segmented groups and then map them to when they're doing that new workflow in the new system. And when they do that, you can then automate the delivery to make them adopt it in the new way, because you can then both match like who did it in the legacy system, but you can also see how they did it in the legacy system. So all of your process mapping and journey mapping comes into handy there to show this is the old process, this is the new process, and then it maps that together to deliver to the right person at the right time. So looking at what they've done, not only who they are, but what they've done and all of those workflows becomes a really key component here. And then when it comes to the reinforcement, right, like it's really, really hard to do this manually at scale. So this is again where technology is your tool, is your power. And when you look at delivering reinforcement across all of these audiences and workflows again, how do you do that in a way that reinforces in the right way, right? So you have things that people are doing every day. You have some things that people are doing ad hoc. So again, being able to automate this to the time that they are doing it is very, very critical. So, and this could be things like monthly refreshers. You could have a reminder every time they start a workflow. And that's data that you have from the ERP that you're implementing. So you can see when someone starts something, that's when a specific enablement, training, communications is triggered. So it's all triggered reinforcement based on people starting workflows. And you can also set, for example, so the first time someone does it, they get this. The 10th time, they get something less. And the 20th time, they might not get anything at all. And set that based on frequency. Because you might know like the behavioral psychology behind adopting new behaviors, right? It takes 21 times. You need to do something 21 times to actually adopt a new behavior. So if it's something that you're doing every day, sure, like do it super intensive for the first 3 weeks, then someone tends to have adopted it. But just move that to quarterly, and suddenly we're talking 5 years, because that's how long time it would take to do something quarterly. And if you take something annually, suddenly we're talking 21 years. So that's important to keep in mind with reinforcement. And what we see is that usually it's between 3 to 4 years to get to full adoption in all of these workflows, because you have all of these ad hoc workflows as well. So automate it. Don't waste your time doing this manually. Just do it with technology. Adaptation then. So looking at the data and analytics, and this is where the critical component of adapting to different audiences and how they're adopting it becomes so key. So once you've gone live and you say like adoption is mixed, being able to see who's adopting, who isn't adopting, and then being able to activate them differently is the key component here. So if you look at activation analytics, so this could be how people engage with the activation content, like who completed a certain action or a check-in, their confidence levels in different things, have they started something, have they not done something? All of that is your leading indicators, right? And then you combine that with the ERP usage data, which is your lagging indicators or your results. And then what you can do is work backwards to get what are the predictive analytics that actually leads to adoption of X. So starting to see this is a group that is adopting this particular workflow really well. What do they do 30 days ago, 60 days ago, and 90 days ago that actually led them to eventually adopt this? So your platform analytics, for instance, of a change activation platform, those become your leading indicators to then match to the actual ERP adoption. And matching those together is what gives you both predictive analytics, but also where should you escalate? So where should you bring up these issues before they become even bigger? And the key point here is that this compounds over time, right? So every time you roll out a new module, because usually what we see, it's not a big bang at any time, is usually you go like module by module, audience by audience over anywhere from a 12 to 36 month period to roll out to different parts of the world, different groups, and so on. And the key thing here is that you learn, right? So every new rollout becomes faster and more targeted and more effective than last, because the system then picks up what actually works with different audiences and what are some of these best practices. So you can see the resistant groups who are top performing, like who are some of those early workflow errors and teams needing some more time. So that gives you continuous insights on how you can intervene better, like where do you might need to support the next group better? What kind of formats work well to drive adoption with them? What kind of reinforcement cadence do you need for different workflows? So all of this compounds over time. So when you start with one module, one audience, that data is then informing the next rollout and the next. So it becomes this compounding hub of all your intelligence, where you can actually leverage that for everything else that you're then rolling out. So that's the other part of adaptation, right? It's both about learning about the groups and audiences that you are working with, but also about learning what works in your organization and then seeing similar type of audiences. How do you best engage them? So it becomes smarter, better, faster over time. And you learn as a transformation officer, as a change team, how do you best get to these different groups? And a little bit of a case study on this particular adaptation case, to bring it to life. So we were working with a pharma company, for example, and this was an ERP rollout, and one part of that was the time coding solution. So they were rolling out this time coding project where everyone had to code their time and log their time every single day. Something that nobody wants to do for obvious reasons. That's nothing that anyone enjoys. So massive change management effort, right? And they had multiple personas, tons of different functions, with 30,000 employees. And everyone now suddenly needed to adopt this new module in Workday. And when we looked at leading indicators, it looked at what did people do in Tigerhall. So they use Tigerhall as their change activation platform, and they use that for everything across the business. And tracking what people did in Tigerhall to then what people ultimately did in Workday with this time coding compliance, it was pretty much a one-to-one on different metrics. So they could then, when they started, the first rollout was 500 people, then 5,000, and they made audience by audience. And they could track from those first 500 exactly what predictive analytics, what were the leading indicators, the leading behaviors that ultimately led to time coding adoption. And then that's what they learned to then roll out to the next audience, and the audience after that. So they thought that this was going to take 12 months. They had counted 12 months to get to full adoption of this. And they had 94% adoption in 2 months. And that's simply from learning from the data, leveraging the data, segmenting the different audiences, using that data to, again, further better segment the audiences. So all of that coming together. So that's an example of how you can use intelligence and data that you get from a platform like Tigerhall to then be able to further drive the adaptation, and reinforcement over time. And it just makes such a big difference compared to emailing everyone and then seeing what happens, but actually not having any idea. So very, very close correlation between leading indicators, lagging indicators, and then learning from those leading indicators to keep doing it. And tactically, what made this example really work, right? It was super personalized. So stakeholder groups, it was built around the time coding behavior. So the way they did, looking at what we spoke about earlier with workflows, it looked at who does time coding, how often, who hasn't even done anything yet, who hasn't started on this. So all of those workflow actions that we spoke about, that's used to build out the segmentation and build out the stakeholder groups and targeting. So it's not about how long have you been with a company or who do you report to. There was part of that as well at the very wide level, but being able to go super granular around the behavioral data from Workday and using that for the audience segmentation, very, very key part of the success. So, and that's data that is live, right? So many organizations that I talk to oh, we don't have any data, it's so bad, da, da, da. And I always say, everyone has shitty data. There is no organization that has good data ever. I haven't seen one. And I would love to meet one, but everyone just has terrible, terrible data. And that's why when we look at workflow actions, that's why that personalization factor is also so powerful, because there is no such thing as shitty data in workflow actions, because either people do it or they don't do it. There is no such thing as clicks lying, right? If I start a module, if I do time coding, if I don't process a PO, that is very real live data that sits right there. So there is no one that needs to manually update that the way that you might have to do with job titles in a HRIS, for example. Nothing of that. It's all very clear. Who does it? Who doesn't? What exactly do they do? When do they click? So building targeting around those workflow actions becomes key. And then the timing. So this is what we mentioned around the timing. Having the time at the right, having the enablement and all these comms and training delivered at the time when people do it is super, super powerful. And also, I would add here, when people are not doing it. So something that's even more powerful is someone that hasn't done something, and what you can set is like people haven't done it for 1 day or for 2 days or for 7 days or for 30 days. And then by that time growing, you can then adapt and adjust your change activation approach, right? So if someone has not done time coding for 30 days, they could get a podcast in the voice of the CEO going, hey, like you haven't time coded for a month. Like this is why it's important that we don't see you do it. And when you get a podcast in the voice of your CEO, then most people adopt systems pretty quickly. So you can be very creative around how you orchestrate that adoption, but focusing on how long someone hasn't done something and those key behaviors. And there's a lot of best practices that we can share and creative ideas that our clients have made in these areas. So it's a lot of fun and drives a lot of good results. So looking at those, who aren't taking action, and then being more proactive overall in intervention, because that's the other thing when we look at that adoption data, right? Like, yes, you get leading indicators and leading analytics of like what actually drives adoption behavior. So you can start predicting it and start creating that. But also when someone hasn't done something, you can get very targeted interventions based on that. So when someone is not adopting and you can see like there are, what it says here, 43 people in Seattle, they haven't done this specific thing, that will tell you today that those people will not adopt in the next 90 days. So you can start doing interventions like 90 days earlier than you would be able to do before, because you now see that the predictive analytics, the data that leads to adoption is not there today, which means adoption will not be there in day 90. So your interventions and your interactions with leaders and with sponsors becomes a whole different thing compared to when they come to you and just say like 90 days later, hey, like my team hasn't adopted it. We need more change management. We need more enablement. We need more comms. We need more this and that. No, like actually you can already see that 90 days earlier and then just go to them and talk to them about it. So that becomes very powerful too. So this is what we spoke about with those workflow actions. This is an overview of how Tiger Hall works and the context. So we spoke about how having, for example, those ERP provider documentation that serves your context, those workflow actions, when someone does it, when someone doesn't do it, what all of those data points goes into that dynamic personas and the stakeholder groups. And that is then 1 and 2 in this chart is your input. So you feed it that context, feed it the stakeholder groups, and then the system creates the content, delivers it at the right time, gathers feedback from people so that you can get the intelligence around who is a big champion that we could tap into, who might be resisting, where are we seeing resistance and why are we seeing resistance, as well as overarching intelligence around where do we might have capacity right now and how should we allocate our resources? Because that's a big piece when we look at where do we do those interventions. And that's when you're able to pinpoint and say like, oh, it's actually this VP that we're having an issue with, or it's because of this particular resistance reason that we're seeing a challenge over here. So it all forms this loop. So this is the change activation where you then have that alignment, adoption, adaptation, and it keeps improving with more and more data, improving both strategy and stakeholders over time. But this workflow action piece, this is where it sits. So it's part of the persona building and it's all dynamic, right? So once someone has adopted a workflow more, or someone that hasn't done it for a while, they all go into these dynamic stakeholder groups. And that tells the system that this person is now part of this group, i.e. they should get this particular content this particular time. So that's a little bit under the hood and how it works. And from a change management team's perspective, this is the shift that what it looks like on a day-to-day basis. So with a change, like a classic change management approach, is usually a lot about building training decks and like manually tracking workshop attendance and seeing that adoption is not keeping up much later, right? Like when it's already too late in many cases. And when we look at how that day-to-day is in a change activation life, it's very much this building once. So you set up the key behaviors, set up the key criteria, key behaviors. What are the things that we need to see? For example, if we take the time coding example, what do they need to do? How often they need to time code? Once a day, like identifying those key behaviors. That's the strategy portion and building that once. And then the rest of it is all just automated, right? So it's that strategy and thinking up front. And then having those adoption dashboards so that you can actually see upfront what is happening, see those leading indicators and the signals that surface in advance. So you can start seeing like, oh, we're actually not going to see adoption here because people are having questions about this particular area. So it will surface where people have questions, where people have concerns, so that you can know that ahead of time and using that, all of those data points to shape the next phase of it. So many times we see like it's called wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, or phases, and being able to learn between the different waves instead of doing everything from scratch and having the data from wave 1 to then use in wave 2 becomes very, very powerful. And then all the reinforcement is completely automated. So runs while you're sleeping, while you're on holiday, while you're doing anything else that you want to do, all the reinforcement runs. So you never have to think about reinforcement once it's live. It just goes depending on who adopts, who doesn't adopt, what do they do in the ERP, what do they not do in the ERP, and it's just always on reinforcement.